There's something I need to get off my chest. A decade-old memory. One that's always scratching at the back of my mind, like the twisted branches of a dead tree, clawing at my thoughts. It's a tale so harrowing that I've never told anyone about it, not in full detail anyway. The story is set in a distant, desolate place called the Weeping Woods. To understand what happened, you first need to know why I ended up in that godforsaken place, so far from proper civilization, with 3 of my closest friends. We were social science students, all 4 of us. Our academic lives revolved around culture, history, myth, and religion, the works. We were on the brink of taking on an honors research project, and naturally, we wanted something big, something original, something that would stand out. It was Jack, my closest friend, who brought up the idea. He was originally from Pennsylvania, a small town about 50 miles from the woods. We were crammed into a dorm room, each of us brainstorming ideas, when Jack suddenly said, "What about the Weeping Woods?" We all looked at him, puzzled. Tina, who was the folklore junkie among us, was the first to bite. "What about it?" Jack leaned forward, a mischievous grin on his face, but something darker lurked behind his eyes. "Have you ever heard of the Woodwick Walker?" Of course, none of us had. Jack proceeded to tell us about it. His voice dropped, as though he was afraid someone might overhear. "It's an old legend from the area I grew up in," he explained. "The Weeping Woods got their name because people who escaped them were always in tears. That got our attention." "According to who?" I asked, half interested, half dismissive. Jack shrugged. "The people who lived nearby. It was just one of those stories that stuck. My family never liked going near the woods, and neither did anyone else. But it wasn't the woods themselves that scared them, it was something inside." Tina's eyes lit up. "Go on." Jack hesitated, as if he was reconsidering, but then he continued, his voice lowering even further. "They say there's something in the woods. A man, or at least something that looks like a man, but he's part of the forest itself, almost like the trees. His name is the Woodwick Walker." "Why would people cry when they escaped?" Marcus, our other friend, asked, clearly skeptical. Jack looked at him seriously, all traces of his earlier grin gone. "Because they had to leave people behind, people who didn't make it. When they came back, they could never fully explain what happened. They'd just say they saw him, and the one thing they always agreed on was this: don't look at his face. When you encounter him, do not look up. Keep your eyes on the ground, or close them." The room was quiet for a moment. Jack's tone, the way he delivered that last part, it had unnerved all of us. Tina, however, was still intrigued. "I love it. Guys, we should absolutely do this for our research project. Think about it. We'd get to explore a local legend, do some field work and camp out. No way the other groups are doing something this creepy." Marcus looked less enthused. "Creepy is right, but you seriously want to camp out there, in the woods?" I could see the gears turning in his head. Marcus wasn't a fan of anything horror-related, but he didn't want to be the one to back out either. After a moment he sighed. "All right, fine, I'm in." I wasn't as eager as Tina, but I couldn't think of a better idea. And Jack, well, I could tell he had unfinished business with those woods. He wanted to face his fear, even if he wouldn't admit it. So, the decision was made. We packed Jack's old Silverado with everything we'd need for up to 2 weeks out in the wilderness. His truck was a beast, able to carry us, all our gear, and the recording equipment we'd need to document the trip. The drive out of state went by quicker than expected. Jack and I took turns behind the wheel, and we only stopped when we had to for gas or food. Jack spent most of the drive giving us more details about the Weeping Woods and the Woodwick Walker. Every now and then he'd glance into the rearview mirror as though expecting something, or someone, to appear behind us. Tina was buzzing with excitement the whole way. "This is going to be incredible," she kept saying. "No one else is doing anything like this. We're going to get amazing footage." Marcus, on the other hand, was quieter. He tried to stay distracted, but every time the topic of the walker came up, I could see him stiffen. After what felt like days of driving, we finally reached Jack's hometown. It was small, isolated, and it looked like time had passed it by. A single diner sat at the center of town, and that's where we decided to stop for breakfast. The waitress who served us seemed friendly enough, until Jack casually mentioned that we were headed to the Weeping Woods. Her smile faded instantly. "You kids be careful out there," she said. her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Promise me one thing. If you hear anything, anything at all, you keep your eyes on the ground. Don't look up." We tried to laugh it off, but she didn't. Her expression was grave, and the way her hands shook slightly as she refilled our coffee didn't help settle our nerves. Once we were back in the truck, Jack said, "See, it's not just me. People around here don't mess with those woods." Marcus groaned from the back seat. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." "Relax, man," I said, though even I was starting to feel uneasy. "It's just a story, right, Jack?" Jack didn't answer. He just kept driving, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The road that led into the woods wasn't really a road at all. It was more of a barely there track, almost completely covered by fallen branches and thick leaves. Without Jack's trained eye, we might have missed it entirely. As we turned off the main highway, the smooth asphalt gave way to a rough, uneven path, and the trees seemed to close in around us. I couldn't help but notice the way the compass on the dashboard kept pointing northwest, no matter how many times we twisted and turned. It didn't make sense, but nothing about this place did. "The road leads northwest no matter what," Jack explained, though he didn't sound any more confident than the rest of us. The further we drove, the darker it got. The sky was still overcast, but the light filtering through the trees was dimming unnaturally fast. The fog thickened as we wound our way deeper into the woods, and soon we could barely see more than a few feet in front of us. "Jack," Marcus murmured, "you got awfully serious all of a sudden." Jack didn't respond immediately, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "Sorry," he said after a moment. "This place gets to you." I was about to say something to lighten the mood when we rounded a bend and saw it. A massive fallen log blocked the road. "Perfect," Marcus muttered, rolling his eyes. We all piled out of the truck. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, and everything was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Jack grabbed the saws from the truck bed, and we set to work. The tree was huge, its thick limbs tangled in the surrounding branches like a giant skeleton. It took us nearly half an hour to saw through enough of it to make a dent. While Jack and I worked on the log, Tina and Marcus wandered off to take pictures and videos of the surroundings. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of them through the fog, their figures distorted by the mist, like shadows moving through water. "Got it," Jack finally said, his voice breathless. We hooked up the towing line, and with a few revs of the engine, we managed to drag the log off the road. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, and the forest felt alive, more than alive, almost sentient. The weeping woods stood before us now, dark and foreboding, its towering trees like sentinels guarding something far older and more dangerous than any of us were prepared for. As we walked beyond the clearing, the air grew even colder, more oppressive. The fog, thick as smoke, swirled around our feet, clinging to us, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The deeper we ventured, the more disoriented I felt. It wasn't just the winding path or the trees that seemed to grow closer with every step. It was something else. The forest had an unnatural stillness, as though it was waiting for us to make the first mistake. Even the sounds of our footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the fog. "Does anyone else feel off?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded but said nothing. There was no point in admitting what we were all feeling out loud. The last thing we needed was panic. Tina, however, seemed unaffected, her excitement growing with every step. She snapped pictures of the trees, the fog, even us, her enthusiasm relentless. "This is incredible," she murmured to herself. "The atmosphere, the legend, it's all coming together. We're going to have the best project by far." Jack, though, was different. He hadn't said a word since we'd entered the woods. He led the way, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but his shoulders were tense, and I could see the way his jaw clenched every time he looked over his shoulder. Eventually we found a small clearing, a perfect place to set up camp for the night. The ground was damp but relatively flat, and the trees formed a natural circle around us, their branches intertwining like a web. It felt both safe and claustrophobic at the same time. "Here's as good a place as any," Jack muttered, finally breaking his silence. He dropped his pack and started clearing the ground for the tents. We worked quickly, eager to get settled before the light, what little was left of it, faded completely. The fog thickened, swirling around the trees like a living thing, and the air had a chill that crept into my bones. By the time the tents were pitched, the sky had turned a deep, unnatural grey, and night had fallen earlier than it should have. The fire Jack built offered some warmth, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of unease that hung over the camp. We sat around it in silence, the flames casting flickering shadows on the twisted trees surrounding us. Tina was the first to speak, breaking the tension with her usual enthusiasm. "So, Jack," she said, leaning forward with her camera in hand, "you mentioned there was more to the legend. Tell us about the walker." Jack didn't answer at first. He stared into the fire, his face illuminated by its orange glow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "The Woodwick Walker. He's part of the forest. They say the forest took him, made him part of itself. He doesn't walk like we do. He moves with the trees, like they're his limbs." Tina's camera clicked as she captured the moment. "And the survivors? The ones who made it out?" Jack's eyes flicked up to hers, then back to the fire. "They all say the same thing. When you see him, when you feel him close, don't look. Keep your eyes on the ground. If you look at his face..." He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid, but we all understood. "If you look, you don't come back." Marcus shuddered visibly. "This is insane. I don't know why we're out here." Tina shrugged, her excitement undeterred. "It's just a legend, Marcus. Besides, we haven't seen anything weird yet, have we?" The fire crackled in response, sending a burst of sparks into the air. I watched as the shadows stretched and twisted on the trees, distorting them into grotesque shapes. But Marcus wasn't convinced. He shifted in his seat, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "I don't like it. I don't like how quiet it is." I had to admit, I agreed with him. The silence of the forest was unsettling. No animals, no wind, just the faint creaking of the trees in the distance, and even that sounded wrong, as though the trees themselves were groaning under the weight of something unseen. We ate dinner in relative silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The fire was the only source of comfort in the ever-growing darkness. It felt like the woods were closing in around us, the fog thickening, creeping closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Eventually, Jack stood up. "We should sleep. Tomorrow we'll go deeper." We all nodded, grateful for the excuse to retreat into our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. The moment I lay down, the oppressive silence returned, and the creaking of the trees grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just the natural groaning of wood anymore. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Marcus shifting restlessly in his tent next to mine, and every now and then I caught a glimpse of Tina's flashlight flickering through the fog. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate creaking sound like wood bending under great pressure. It wasn't far. It was right outside the camp. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then Jack's voice cut through the silence, low and trembling. "He's here. Don't look at him. Stay in your tents. Don't look." I froze. The creaking grew louder, closer. The sound of something heavy moving through the trees, bending the branches, dragging itself forward. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. I could hear Jack's ragged breathing from across the camp. He was terrified, and that scared me more than anything else. Jack never got scared. The creaking stopped, right outside my tent. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind, the crackling of the dying fire, and the faint, irregular breathing of my friends. I wanted to scream, to call out to Jack, to Tina, to Marcus, anything to break the suffocating silence, but I couldn't. My throat was dry, my limbs frozen in place. The fear had taken hold of me completely. And then, nothing. The creaking stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. I couldn't hear Jack anymore. "Jack?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. No response. I crawled to the edge of my tent and unzipped it just enough to peer out. The fog was thick, swirling around the dying embers of the fire, but there was no sign of Jack. His tent flap was open, the flashlight he had been holding lying on the ground. "Guys?" I called, louder this time. Tina and Marcus emerged from their tents, their faces pale. "Where's Jack?" Tina asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I replied, scanning the trees. The shadows shifted and danced at the edge of the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. Tina picked up Jack's flashlight, her hands shaking. He was right here. He was just... Marcus was already packing up his gear. We need to go, now, before it gets worse. We can't just leave him, Tina protested, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We'll search for him, I said, though even as I spoke the words I knew we wouldn't find him. Not here, not in these woods, but we need to stick together. We grabbed our flashlights, bundled up against the cold, and ventured into the fog. The darkness was thicker now, almost tangible, like it was trying to swallow us whole. Our flashlights barely pierced the mist, and the trees seemed to twist and move in the shadows, warping into unfamiliar shapes. We called Jack's name over and over again, but the only answer we got was the sound of the wind whistling through the trees, and the distant, rhythmic creaking of wood. And then, just as I thought we'd be wandering aimlessly forever, I saw something. A pale shape in the distance, barely visible through the fog. At first I thought it was Jack. Relief flooded through me, and I moved toward it without thinking. But then I stopped. The figure was standing too still. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like they had been stretched out unnaturally. And its face, I couldn't see its face. Tina gasped behind me. Oh God! Marcus grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Don't, look! I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on us, watching, waiting. Back to the camp, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. We turned slowly, never looking directly at the figure, and made our way back to the camp. The creaking followed us the whole way, just behind us, always just out of sight. By the time we reached the clearing, the fire had died out completely. The darkness felt thicker, more suffocating than ever. Our breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps as we huddled together, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. Tina clutched Jack's flashlight so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Marcus was the first to break the silence. We need to leave, he said, his voice shaky but firm. We have to get out of these woods now. But Jack, Tina whispered, her voice cracking, we can't just leave him out there. We have to find him. I wanted to agree with her, but deep down I knew Marcus was right. Jack was gone, and whatever had taken him, whatever was out there, wasn't going to stop with just him. We were next if we didn't leave soon. We'll get help, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We'll come back with a search party, but right now, we have to get out before it gets worse. Tina hesitated, her eyes wide and terrified, but finally she nodded. Okay, but we have to hurry. We gathered what little we could carry, abandoning most of our gear in our desperate attempt to leave the clearing. The path back to the truck was barely visible in the fog, and every step felt like it was leading us deeper into the woods instead of out. As we walked, the oppressive silence returned. The only sounds were our hurried footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The creaking, however, had stopped. The eerie groaning of the trees that had followed us before was now gone, replaced by something far worse. Absolute stillness. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the pale figure standing just behind us, watching, waiting. My heart raced with every step, the fear of what might happen if I looked up gnawing at the edges of my mind. Marcus led the way, cutting through the fog with long, hurried strides. Tina and I followed closely, sticking together, our flashlights barely illuminating the path in front of us. Then, without warning, Tina stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I stopped too, straining to listen. At first there was nothing but the silence, thick and suffocating, but then I heard it. A faint whispering, soft, like wind through the trees, but carrying something darker, more sinister beneath it. It was coming from all around us, growing louder with each passing second. "It's just the wind," Marcus muttered, though his voice sounded anything but certain. But it wasn't the wind. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of reach, hidden in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, desperate, like they were trying to warn us of something. "Keep moving," I urged, trying to push the growing panic out of my mind. We moved faster, our footsteps crunching loudly against the leaves and twigs beneath us. But the whispering followed, always just behind us, like an invisible presence creeping closer and closer. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something else, footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, moving through the trees just out of sight, keeping pace with us. My heart pounded in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. But I knew better than to break into a full sprint. Whatever it was that was following us, it wasn't human, and it was patient. "Don't look," Marcus whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. "Keep your eyes down. Don't look." I followed his lead, staring at the ground as we hurried forward, refusing to look up. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they sounded like they were right beside us. We were almost at the truck, I told myself. Just a little further, and we'd be safe. The truck sped down the dirt road, bouncing and rattling over the uneven ground as Marcus drove like his life depended on it. Because it did. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Tina sat beside me, her breathing fast and shallow, her eyes wide and unblinking. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The horror of what we had just experienced was too fresh, too raw. As we left the thick trees of the weeping woods behind, I dared to glance into the side mirror, half expecting to see the twisted, pale figure of the Woodwick walker standing in the middle of the road watching us leave. But there was nothing. Just the fog, swirling behind us like a living thing. The road finally smoothed out as we reached the highway, and Marcus slowed the truck down to a more manageable speed. The oppressive silence that had haunted us in the woods was gone, replaced by the comforting hum of the truck's engine and the occasional whoosh of passing cars. But the weight of what had happened still hung heavy in the air. "Is he gone?" Tina's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon him back. I looked out the window again, my eyes scanning the dark, empty road behind us. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The fear still clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Marcus remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I could tell he was in shock, the same way I felt, like our minds were struggling to process what we had just seen. It wasn't until we were miles away from the woods, the dense forest long behind us, that anyone spoke again. "We can't go back," Marcus said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "No," I agreed, "we can't." Tina, still trembling, hugged her knees to her chest, her camera resting forgotten in her lap. What do we do about Jack?" Her voice cracked at the mention of his name, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Jack was gone. We all knew it, even if we didn't want to say it out loud. Whatever had taken him, the walker, the forest, something else, we couldn't bring him back. But what could we say to anyone? How could we explain what had happened out there without sounding insane? "We'll report him missing," I said quietly, my mind racing as I tried to figure out how we could explain what happened without telling the truth. "We'll say we lost track of him in the fog, that we got separated." Marcus nodded grimly. "No one will believe the rest of it anyway." And that was the truth. No one would believe that the Woodwick walker, a figure from an old, half-forgotten legend, had taken our friend. No one would believe that we had barely escaped with our lives. The rest of the drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to push away the gnawing terror that threatened to consume us. Days turned into weeks, and Jack was officially listed as a missing person. We gave our statements to the authorities, how we had ventured into the Weeping Woods as part of a research project, how we had become separated in the fog, how we searched for him but found no trace. The police conducted their own search, sending teams into the woods to look for any sign of him, but after a few days, they came up with nothing. The case went cold. Life, as it always does, moved on. Classes resumed, the semester dragged on, and we tried to return to normal, but things were never the same. Tina, once so bright and full of life, withdrew into herself, her enthusiasm for the project gone. She barely spoke anymore, her eyes always distant, as though she was still trapped in the fog of those woods. Marcus dropped out of the program entirely, moving back home without so much as a goodbye. He never talked about what happened after that day, and I never saw him again. As for me, I tried to forget. I tried to bury the memories, to convince myself that it was all some terrible nightmare, that what we saw wasn't real. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the shadows in my room seemed to move on their own, I'd hear it again, that faint creaking of wood, like trees bending under some invisible weight. And the whispering. It was always there, just on the edge of hearing. Soft, insistent, like the voices of those who had been lost to the weeping woods, calling out from the dark, forever trapped. I never went back. I couldn't. But part of me, a small part that I tried to ignore, wondered if Jack was still there, wandering through the trees, part of the forest now. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could see him, just a pale figure in the distance, standing among the twisted trees, watching, waiting. Years have passed since then, but the memory of that day still haunts me. The fear never truly went away, and sometimes I wonder if it ever will. Because the weeping woods never let go, not completely. And in the stillness of the night, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows grow long, I remember Jack's final warning. Don't look. And I know, some places aren't meant to be found. It was early August in Marin, and the town was still half asleep, but I was wide awake, as usual, thinking about the dead. The kind of thoughts that cling to you in the middle of the night and won't let go even when the sun rises. I lay belly up in front of the rusting old fan that had been struggling to survive as long as I had. It whirred pitifully, pushing out what little air it could as it swayed back and forth side to side, like a tired old woman struggling to cross a busy street. Each creak of the blades cut through the heavy stillness in the room, slicing through the heat that pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I thought about hurling it out of the window, ending its miserable existence. The old thing was practically wheezing, and yet it was still better than nothing. In this heat, even a weak, half-hearted breeze was something I wasn't willing to give up. So I left it to whir away, despite its groaning protests, and stared at the ceiling, letting my mind drift back to the dead. It always did. Eventually, there was no stopping it. My legs hung above me, resting against the wall, a wall covered in Polaroids, old, time-stained snapshots that had become my wallpaper, reminders of all the people I'd loved, all the people who had passed through my life, my celluloid guardian angels. The photographs had started as a few mementos, but over the years they had multiplied, spreading across the walls like ivy, wrapping my room in memories. I couldn't sleep without them watching over me, those frozen faces forever captured in a moment of happiness or sadness or something in between. Sweat beaded at the base of my neck, pooling in the hollows of my collarbones. Even though the blinds were pulled shut, the sun was relentless, its heat finding every crack, every gap in the blinds, creeping through as if determined to remind me it was August and the world outside was still turning, still burning. The door creaked open and Chrissy came in. Her footsteps were loud but familiar, so familiar I didn't even need to look to know it was her. I knew Chrissy from the soles of her boots to the way she breathed, the way her presence filled the room. From soul to soul, we were connected like that. Without a word, she threw herself down onto my bed, her body landing in the same spot it had 1,000 times before. The bed dipped under her weight, her shape as familiar to the mattress as my own. Chrissy was like a part of me, always had been. She could slip into my space as naturally as if it were her own. Her hair, that bright wild pink, fanned out from her head like the soft, smudged colors of a late June sunset. It spread across the pillow in waves, that beautiful chemical halo she wore proudly, the whole summer sky sitting right there on top of her head. She looked as effortless as she always did, even in this oppressive heat, as if nothing could ever really touch her. "Fuck me up the ass and call me Jesus, but it's hot," she said, sighing dramatically as she threw her legs up to meet mine. Her dusty combat boots hovered just inches from the Polaroid wall, dangerously close to scuffing the pictures. I could almost hear her thoughts, a little smirk playing on her lips as she flirted with the idea of nudging them with her boots, just to see if I'd react. Her right boot settled in front of a Polaroid of us on our first day of high school. Eyes bright with excitement, middle fingers raised at the camera, a teenage rebellion that felt so powerful at the time. Matching chipped purple nail polish, arms slung around each other like we owned the world. We thought we did back then. The whole future ahead of us, like the horizon was something we could grab hold of and bend to our will. Her left boot landed just above a picture of me doing a handstand on the beach. She'd taken that one. I could still hear her laughing as she snapped the photo, the warm sand between our toes, the smell of salt and summer in the air. It was the year her brother Travis got his license, and we'd spent every weekend driving as far as the gas in his truck would take us. Chrissy would scream at Travis to go faster, pounding the back of his headrest, while I leaned out the window, letting the wind whip through my hair. We spent that whole spring pretending we didn't know what Marin was, like the town didn't exist behind us, like it couldn't catch us if we drove fast enough. Well then, Jesus, did you bring any lube? I asked, glancing over at her with a smirk. She grinned lazily, sticking her tongue out in response. In this heat, even her sharp wit had been dulled. She didn't have the energy to come up with a snappy comeback, so we just let the moment hang in the air, suspended between us like so many moments had been before. We lay there in silence for a while, heads hanging off the bed, staring at the world upside down. It was a strange sensation, like looking at life from a different angle. The room was upside down, but Chrissy, she was still the right way up. No matter how many things shifted around us, she was always constant, always Chrissy. After a while, she broke the silence. "It's going to happen again, Sadie." Her voice was quiet, almost like she didn't want to disturb the air that had settled between us, but I could hear the tension beneath her words. There was no escaping it. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. The dead were always talking in Chrissy's head, whispering their stories, their fates, their unfinished business. They never stopped, and neither did she. "Okay," I said, sitting up. There wasn't anything else to say. When Chrissy said it was going to happen again, I didn't question her. I never questioned her. The only thing left to do was to figure out how we were going to stop it. When and where. She stayed lying down, her eyes closed against the oppressive heat. "Don't know that yet. Don't even know his name yet." Her forehead creased slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "But he's getting hungry." She shifted, like the thought made her uncomfortable. "He's been dreaming about her." Dreaming. That's what Chrissy called it when she felt the pull of a man about to do something terrible. She could feel them in the in-between, the place where life and death blurred, where fates were written and sometimes rewritten. "Dreaming real bad dreams," she added, her voice barely more than a whisper. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and forced my voice to stay calm. "Just tell me what to do, where to be. We'll stop him." I looked over at her, taking in her familiar features. Chrissy was still the only thing in the world that made sense to me. "We always do." She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. "I know, but I think you'll have to kill him this time." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I side-eyed her, watching as she sighed and swore under her breath at the fan, which seemed to be working even slower now. She panted like a dog in the summer heat, her chest rising and falling as if the very air around her was pressing down too hard. I looked at her carefully. Her face was so familiar, yet at the same time it wasn't. The Chrissy I had known all my life was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. The freckles that dusted her nose, the small silver bar through her right eyebrow that caught the light just right, flashing like a tiny star. Her eyeshadow was dark, smudged like she hadn't bothered to take it off the night before, and even with her eyes closed, I could picture the green underneath, deep and rich like the leaves on the trees in springtime. But there was more to her now, more than just the girl I grew up with. The left side of her face, the part that had been shattered when she died, was a permanent reminder of what had been taken from us. Her jawbone was gone, leaving a gaping hole where her face had been smashed in. The jagged half-moon of her cheek was torn open, revealing the teeth beneath, cracked and yellowed with death. Her eye socket hung just below her still bright eye, the cartilage around her brow exposed, raw and sharp. Blood hovered near her skin, looping in soft tendrils, suspended in the space between life and death, just like Chrissy herself. She was my best friend, and despite everything, I never got tired of looking at her. Even in death, she was still Chrissy. I guess I should mention that part. Chrissy is dead. Specifically, Chrissy is dead because when we were 16 years old, a man hunted her down through the woods, bashed her head in with a rock, and left her to die after he was done with her body. Chrissy has been dead for 5 years, 11 months, and 22 days, if we're being really specific. The first time I saw Chrissy after she died, I thought I had finally lost my mind. Grief does that to people, you know. It pushes you to the edge of reason and leaves you teetering there, unsure of what's real and what isn't. But this wasn't just some hallucination born from sorrow. Chrissy came back. 2 weeks after she died, she was standing at the foot of my bed, her head tilted slightly, like she was just as confused to see me as I was to see her. At first I couldn't move. I thought I was still dreaming, caught between the layers of sleep and waking. But when I rubbed my eyes, she didn't disappear. She was still there, just as I remembered her, except for the gaping wound where half her face used to be. She smiled at me with the part of her mouth that was still intact, and I thought I was going insane. I screamed. I tried to, but nothing came out. I remember backing away, my back hitting the wall as I tried to figure out what was happening. The girl I'd grown up with, the girl who was supposed to be dead and buried, was standing right there, in my room, with that easy, crooked smile she always wore, despite the wreckage of her face. "Hey, Sadie," she had said, her voice soft but familiar, like she had never left. "What's the matter? You look like you've seen a ghost." And I had. That was 5 years ago. I don't think I ever really got used to seeing Chrissy again, but the shock wore off eventually. She didn't explain much, and honestly, I didn't push her. There was something about seeing your dead best friend that just put things into perspective. Maybe some questions didn't need answers. Maybe some things were better left unsaid. What mattered was that she was still with me. In a way, I mean not fully. Chrissy was still dead, but whatever she was now, whatever had brought her back, it had also given her a gift, a terrible gift. At first, Chrissy didn't know what was happening either. She thought she was just back to be with me, maybe. But soon, the dreams started. She called them dreams, but they weren't like dreams at all. They were more like premonitions, glimpses into something horrible. The first time it happened, Chrissy described it as slipping into another world, a place where time didn't exist the same way it did for the living. The in-between, she called it. And in that place she could feel death coming. It was always young women, girls who were around our age, girls who hadn't been given the chance to grow old. At first, the dreams were vague, flashes of faces, names, places, like watching a movie in a room filled with fog. But as time passed, the visions became clearer. Chrissy could see the men, the predators, who were about to snatch those lives away. She could feel their hunger, their twisted desires, their cruel intentions. The darkness that surrounded them became palpable, like smoke seeping through the cracks in the world. Chrissy couldn't stop them on her own. She was bound to the space between life and death, unable to touch the living, unable to interact with the world the way she once could. But I could. And that's where I came in. At first, I didn't know what to do with the things Chrissy told me. It felt unreal, like something out of a horror movie. But then the first girl disappeared. A girl Chrissy had dreamt about, seen in one of her premonitions. I recognized her face on the news, and I knew Chrissy had been right. That was when it all started. When Chrissy and I decided that if we couldn't save her, we could save the next one, and the next one after that. That first time was messy. I was still reeling from the fact that Chrissy was even back, let alone the idea that I could stop these monsters before they acted. I didn't have the stomach for it then. I tried to tip off the police, but it didn't work. The man slipped through the cracks of the system, the girl died, and I had to live with knowing that I could have done more. So I changed my approach. I began to plan, I began to study the patterns, and eventually I stopped relying on others to do the dirty work. Now, 5 years later, I'm still here. I'm still stopping them, these men who think they can take whatever they want, but each time, it takes a little more out of me. The room felt unbearably hot now, but not just from the heat outside. There was something heavy in the air, something that made it hard to breathe. I looked at Chrissy, her one good eye fixed on the ceiling, her lips slightly parted as if she was lost in thought. Her dead limbs didn't sweat. She couldn't feel the oppressive heat the way I could. "Tell me more about him," I said, breaking the silence. "About this Amos Everett." Chrissy sat up slowly, as if shaking off the weight of the visions she carried. She crossed her legs under her, her gaze distant as she tried to pull the details from the in-between. "He's been dreaming about her," she repeated. "Beth, he'll follow her from the bar tonight, wait for her to take the alley, and that's where he'll grab her." I nodded, taking in the information. I could picture it in my head already. I'd been to that alley before, narrow, dark, easy to hide in. If he was anything like the others we'd stopped, he'd know just how to make her disappear without anyone noticing. "And me?" I asked, my voice steady, though I could feel the fear rising in my chest. "What did you mean when you said he was thinking about me?" Chrissy's eyes met mine. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "It's hard to explain. When I slip into the in-between, I usually just see the girls, and sometimes the men, like shadows moving through fog. But this one, he's different. It's like he knows we're watching. I could feel him, feel his attention shifting toward you, like he's aware of what we're doing." I swallowed hard. "So he's coming for me too?" Chrissy didn't answer. She didn't need to. The weight of her silence pressed down on me. It wasn't just about saving Beth tonight. This time, it was personal. This time, The hunter knew I was coming. I stood up from the bed, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I walked to the window. The blinds were still shut tight, but I could feel the sun's heat trying to force its way inside, as relentless as the thoughts swirling in my head. "I'll need more than just a knife this time," I muttered, mostly to myself. Chrissy nodded, her gaze following me as I moved through the room, grabbing my keys and shoving them into my pocket. "Be careful, Sadie," she said softly. "He's not like the others." "I know," I replied, my hand hovering over the doorknob, "but neither am I." Chrissy said, her voice almost a whisper. A cold chill ran through me despite the heat pressing in from every side. This was different. In all the years I'd been doing this, hunting these men down and stopping them before they could take their next victim, none of them had ever known about me. I'd always been the one with the advantage, moving in the shadows, getting there first, doing what had to be done to stop them. But now I was the hunted too. I felt the weight of the knife in my hand, the familiar cold steel that had been my constant companion through all of this. I knew how to use it. I had been forced to use it before. I hadn't wanted to, but there had been no other choice. Some men just didn't stop. Some were so consumed by their darkness that there was no saving them, no other way to stop the spread of their poison. And now, it seemed, Amos Everett was one of them. I turned to Chrissy, her pale, broken face watching me carefully. "If he's coming for me, then I'll be ready," I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Chrissy's eyes didn't leave mine, but I could see the flicker of fear behind them, the same fear that had started when she first came back to me, 2 weeks after her death. She wasn't afraid for herself. She never was. But she was afraid for me. Afraid of what this life had turned me into. "You can't do this alone, Sadie," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "I won't be alone," I replied, meeting her gaze. "I'll have you." But even as I said the words, I knew that Chrissy's presence, as comforting as it was, couldn't change the reality of what was about to happen. She couldn't physically stop Amos. She couldn't pull the trigger or swing the knife. All of that was on me. I was the one who had to do the dirty work, the one who had to be ready to face this monster head on. And tonight it was going to get messy. By the time I got to the bar, the sun had started to set, painting the sky in deep purples and fiery reds. The bar's neon sign flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement outside. I parked the truck a few blocks away, slipping into the shadows as I made my way toward the alley. It was the same place Chrissy had seen in her vision, the same place Beth would unknowingly walk into tonight, the same place where Amos Everett would be waiting for her. And now I would be waiting for him. I crouched low behind a dumpster, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the sounds of the evening settling around me. Cars passed by on the street behind me, people laughing and talking as they made their way in and out of the bar. To them, it was just another summer night. But for me, and for Beth, it was the edge of something much darker. I checked my watch, 9:45 p.m. Beth would be leaving soon. I had my knife strapped to my side, hidden under the loose fabric of my jacket. I brought a gun, too, something I hadn't used much, but tonight I knew I'd need it. Chrissy had been clear about that. Amos wasn't like the others. He was stronger, smarter, and he was expecting me. As I waited, the minutes dragging by like hours, I let my mind drift back to the last time I'd killed a man. It had been almost a year ago. His name was Greg Hamilton, a middle-aged guy who worked as a mechanic in a small town just outside of Marin. On the surface, he was just another quiet man, unremarkable, with nothing to distinguish him from anyone else. But Chrissy had seen him. She had seen what he was planning to do to a young girl named Maria. She had seen the way his mind twisted and turned, consumed by his desires, and how close he had come to acting on them. I had followed him for weeks, waiting for the moment when it would be too late to stop him through any other means. And then, one night, it happened. He had grabbed Maria as she was leaving her job at a convenience store, dragging her into the back of his van. I had been there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. I had pulled the trigger without thinking, without hesitation. The gunshot had echoed through the alley, and Greg Hamilton had crumpled to the ground. Maria never saw me. She never knew who saved her life that night, and that was the way it had to be. But I had carried the weight of that kill with me every day since, because no matter how many lives I saved, no matter how many men I stopped, it never felt like enough. The sound of footsteps snapped me out of my thoughts. I tensed, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife. Beth. I could see her now, coming out of the bar, her dark hair bouncing as she walked, laughing at something on her phone. She was oblivious to the danger around her, to the man who was already lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to turn down the alley. And then I saw him. Amos Everett. He moved with purpose, his tall frame cutting through the dim light of the alley like a shadow. His eyes were fixed on Beth, his movements deliberate, predatory. But this time, he wasn't just looking at her. As he got closer, his gaze flicked up, scanning the alley, as if he knew I was there. I felt my stomach twist. Chrissy had been right. He knew. I stayed low, my breath shallow, watching as he moved closer to Beth. She was still walking, still unaware of the danger behind her. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for the right moment, every muscle in my body coiled, ready to strike. But before I could make a move, Amos turned his head slightly, his eyes locking directly onto mine. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my grip tightening on the knife. He knew I was there. He had known all along. This wasn't just a hunt for him. This was a game. "Come out," Amos called, his voice low and mocking. "I've been waiting for you." I stayed where I was, my mind racing. If I stepped out now, I'd be putting myself directly in his line of sight. But if I didn't... "Sadie," Chrissy's voice echoed in my head. "Don't let him get to you." I took a deep breath, my fingers brushing the handle of the gun at my side. I couldn't hesitate. Not now, not when Beth's life and mine depended on it. I stepped out from behind the dumpster, my eyes locked on Amos. He was still smiling, his hands loose at his sides, as if he wasn't the least bit concerned that I had a weapon. "You're not as sneaky as you think," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I've been watching you, just like you've been watching me." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. This wasn't a conversation. This was a fight. Amos took a step toward me, and I tightened my grip on the gun. "You're not going to shoot me," he said, his voice taunting. "You're just a little girl playing a game you don't understand." I leveled the gun at him, my hands steady. "You don't know a damn thing about me." For a moment, time seemed to stretch out, the world shrinking down to just the two of us. The alley, the bar, the sounds of the night all faded into the background as Amos and I faced each other, two predators circling their prey. And then, without warning, Amos lunged. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the alley, loud and deafening, but Amos didn't stop. He kept coming, his face twisted into a snarl as he reached for me. I fired again, the recoil jolting through my arm, but it was too late. He was on me. We hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs as his weight pressed down on me. His hands closed around my throat, squeezing, his face inches from mine. His breath was hot against my skin, his eyes wild with fury. I struggled, clawing at his hands, trying to break free, but he was too strong. I could feel my vision starting to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges as his grip tightened. This was it. I was going to die. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Chrissy. She was standing just behind Amos, her broken face illuminated by the flickering streetlight, her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "You're not alone," she whispered. With the last bit of strength I had left, I reached for the knife at my side. My fingers closed around the handle, and in one swift motion, I drove it into Amos's side. He let out a strangled cry, his grip on my throat loosening just enough for me to push him off. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air as I backed away, watching as he crumpled to the ground. Amos lay there, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, his blood pooling around him, dark and thick. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with shock, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. For a moment, everything was still, the sounds of the night fading away, the weight of the world pressing down as Amos Everett lay dying at my feet. I stared down at him, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. His eyes, full of disbelief, met mine, and for the first time, I saw something besides hunger in them. Fear. The realization that he had lost, that whatever power he thought he had over me, over Beth, was gone. The knife was still buried in his side, his blood seeping through his shirt, staining the ground beneath him. Amos's breaths came out in shallow, labored gasps, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, grasping at life. His eyes flicked between me and the sky above, like he was still searching for an escape. "You," he rasped, blood bubbling up at the corners of his mouth. "You killed me." The words came out slow, weak. They didn't sound like an accusation, more like a final statement of disbelief, as if he hadn't seen this coming, as if he thought he was invincible. I wiped the blood off my hands, trembling as I took a step back. "You never gave anyone else a chance," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why should I give you one?" Amos coughed, his body jerking with the effort, and his gaze finally left mine. His eyes fluttered shut as his body went still, sinking into the cold pavement beneath him. It was over. But it didn't feel like victory, it never did. I stood there for a long time, staring at the body. My hands were still shaking, the adrenaline coursing through me, refusing to let me relax. Every muscle in my body ached from the struggle, but it wasn't just physical pain that weighed on me. It was the knowledge of what I had done, of what I would have to keep doing. Because this wouldn't be the last time. There would be more men like Amos Everett, more girls like Beth who needed saving, more blood on my hands. I turned to look for Chrissy, but she was gone. She always disappeared after these moments, like a shadow slipping back into the dark. I knew she'd come back. She always did. But it was times like this that I felt the weight of her absence the most. Even when she was here, I was the one who had to carry the burden of doing what had to be done. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, blinking away the sting of sweat and tears, and that's when I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps. Beth. She was standing at the mouth of the alley, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, her phone still in her hand. She hadn't seen what had happened. She had just heard the gunshots, the struggle. She had been lucky. But now, she stood frozen, her face pale in the dim light. "Go home," I said, my voice cracking as I forced the words out. "Just go home." Beth blinked, her mouth opening as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She glanced at the body on the ground, then back at me, before nodding slowly. She turned and walked away, her footsteps growing fainter until the night swallowed them completely. I didn't watch her go. I didn't need to. I had saved her. She'd go home, wake up tomorrow, and live her life without ever knowing how close she had come to losing it. She'd never know about Amos Everett, or the men like him. She'd never know about me. And that was how it had to be. I sank to the ground, my back pressing against the brick wall of the alley, my legs weak beneath me. The knife still lay on the ground next to Amos's body, glinting in the faint light, covered in his blood. I wanted to leave it there, but I knew I couldn't. There were things I had to do, things that had become routine by now. Clean up, cover my tracks, make sure no one would ever trace this back to me. I took a deep breath, pushing myself to my feet. I had done this before. I knew what needed to be done. But that didn't make it any easier. By the time I got back home, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange. I parked the truck in its usual spot, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, trying to collect myself, trying to breathe. But it felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. The door creaked open, and I knew without looking that Chrissy had returned. She slid into the passenger seat, her broken face turned toward me, her eyes soft and sad. "You did good, Sadie," she said, her voice quiet. I shook my head, my fingers gripping the wheel tighter. "I killed him." "You saved her," Chrissy replied, reaching out as if to touch me, but her hand passed right through my arm, her ghostly form unable to make contact. "You saved Beth." "Ma." I closed my eyes, letting the weight of her words settle over me. I had saved Beth, but that didn't change what I had done. It didn't erase the blood on my hands. "I'm tired, Chrissy," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." She didn't respond right away, but I could feel her presence beside me, steady and constant. "You're stronger than you think, Sadie. You've always been stronger." "Wow." I opened my eyes and turned to look at her. Her face was still broken, her jaw still shattered, the blood still swirling in the air around her wounds. But she was smiling, just a small, sad smile, the kind of smile that said she understood, that she knew exactly what I was feeling because she had felt it too. "I don't want to do this anymore," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to keep killing." Chrissy's smile faltered for a moment, but then she nodded. "I know, but sometimes it's the only way." I turned away from her, staring out the windshield at the empty street in front of me. The sun was rising, the world waking up, and for a moment, it looked like any other day. But for me, it would never be just another day, not after this, not after Amos Everett. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out of the truck. Chrissy followed me, her footsteps silent as she moved beside me. We walked back into the house together, the weight of the night hanging over us like a cloud that refused to lift. I dropped my keys on the counter and sank into the old chair in the corner of the living room, my hands still trembling as I stared down at them. "How many more, Chrissy?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Chrissy didn't answer right away. She just stood there watching me with those same evergreen eyes that had seen too much. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but as long as there are girls like Beth, there will always be men like Amos." I nodded, my throat tight. I knew she was right. I had always known, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. For a long time we sat there in silence, the first rays of sunlight spilling into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. And in those shadows I could see the faces of the dead, the ones I had saved, the ones I hadn't. I had saved Beth, but I had lost another piece of myself in the process. And as I sat there, with Chrissy by my side, I couldn't help but wonder how many more pieces I had left to give. We'd given up our dream of ever owning a house long ago. We'd been priced out post-COVID, plain and simple. Every day, it seemed like housing prices rose higher and higher, leaving people like us, working people, scraping by, completely in the dust. I'd accepted our fate. We'd be renting forever, probably some overpriced, run-down 3-bedroom ranch from an old guy named Leonard who couldn't give a damn about his tenants, except when it came to measuring the nicks in the wall with a micrometer. We'd keep forking over cash every month, year after year, always treading water, in danger of drowning at any time, always wondering when that final blow would come, the rent hike that would force us to move, the sudden eviction because the owner wanted to sell, or maybe just a phone call saying the house was no longer available. We had no safety, no roots. The American dream of owning a home felt like a cruel joke meant for someone else. But then we found 27 Hillside Lane and everything changed. It felt like a dream, the kind that's too good to be true. The house was priced way below market value. I should have known then that there was something wrong with it, some sort of catch, water damage, fire damage, wasps in the walls, hell, maybe even a ghost or two. That's how these things worked, right? But the house passed inspection, and we were desperate. Desperation makes you ignore things that would normally send up red flags. It was now or never. So we bought the house. And that was the biggest mistake of our lives. I first noticed it on day 4 in the new house. It was late afternoon, the sky already dimming as autumn's early dusk began to creep in. I was standing at the stove, cursing under my breath as I prepared yet another meal for my picky kids. Ava and Hayden were going through a phase. They'd only eat the most time-consuming, irritating foods. Tonight, it was breaded chicken. Simple, right? Except everything with them had to be just perfect. If it wasn't, they'd wrinkle their noses and demand pizza, leaving me seething after hours of work. As I laid the chicken into the sizzling oil, I felt it, a soft breeze across my arm. At first, I ignored it. It was an old house, after all. Drafts were expected. But a moment later, I felt it again, this time across the middle of my back, like someone was standing behind me, brushing against me. I froze, my heart suddenly in my throat. There was something strange about the feeling. It wasn't just a cold draft. It felt deliberate, like fingers caressing my skin. I turned around, half expecting to see Eric standing there, but the kitchen was empty. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, but I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. Old houses settle. They make noises. They have strange air currents. That's what this was, just a draft. Still, I couldn't help myself. I held out my hands and closed my eyes, concentrating, trying to feel where the breeze was coming from. But there was no denying it. There was a breeze, and yet all the windows were closed, and it didn't feel cold like a draft should. I glanced up at the new vent hood over the stove, something we never had in our old place, and something I still didn't quite understand. I turned the knob, trying to see if maybe I'd left it on by accident. "Eric, did you turn the vent on?" Eric wandered in from the living room, looking half asleep. "I don't think so. Why?" "I feel a breeze." He blinked, then walked over to the vent. "Looks like it's off," he said, fiddling with the knobs. He turned around, his brow furrowed. "Do you feel it, though?" I nodded, rubbing my arms as the feeling crept over me again, like the air itself was alive, moving against my skin. He stood still for a moment, focusing. His expression shifted from confusion to mild surprise. "Yeah, I guess I do," he said finally. "So, that was it then. We'd bought a drafty old house, shit insulation probably. I should have expected something to go wrong eventually. We bought the house in September when it was still warm, and now, as we slipped into the cold grip of October, we were discovering just how much heat the place leaked. Great, we'd be in for a brutal winter and sky-high heating bills. But there was something about the breeze that didn't sit right with me, because it wasn't cold. It almost felt warm, like breath against my skin. The thought sent a shiver through me, but before I could dwell on it, the chicken started to burn. I cursed under my breath and ran to the stove, grabbing the tongs to rescue the blackened pieces. "Ava! Hayden! Dinner!" I called out, trying to shake off the strange feeling. As I picked off the burnt bits and arranged the food on plates, the breeze faded from my mind. For a while, I managed to convince myself that it was nothing, just the house settling, just my nerves. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I spiraled into what I call the OCD spiral of death. It happens when my brain locks onto something, a problem, an issue, and convinces me it's life-threatening. I start to imagine the worst-case scenarios, the most horrific possibilities, until I'm convinced that someone's going to die, or we're all going to die, or the world is going to implode. It started with a Google search, random breeze in house. One of the results talked about gas leaks, silent killers, invisible, deadly. That was all it took. In minutes, I had imagined Ava and Hayden's funerals 3 times over, the house going up in flames, us dying in our sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning. I couldn't shake the images. I wasn't going to sleep until I knew the house was safe. The guy that rang the doorbell was young, couldn't have been more than 22. He was tall and spindly, the kind of guy who looked like he spent more time online than in the real world. He carried a heavy toolbox and looked slightly annoyed that he'd been called out so late. Eric, on the other hand, was pissed. He had already gone back to bed, muttering that I was overreacting. "We're not going to die," he had said, his voice dripping with irritation. "Do it in the morning." But I couldn't wait until morning. My mind had already convinced me that if I didn't do something now, we'd never wake up. "So, where do you feel the wind?" the guy asked, looking slightly bored as he set down his toolbox. "The kitchen," I said, leading him to the room. He pulled out a meter that beeped softly as he moved around, scanning the air. He wandered upstairs, then downstairs, pulling out a second meter to do the same thing. I watched him, my stomach twisting with anxiety, waiting for him to find something, anything, that would confirm my worst fears. But when he returned, he shrugged and set down his equipment. "No gas leak," he said, sending off a text on his phone. I let out a shaky breath. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. Something still felt off. "Everything else looks normal," I pressed, my voice tight. He hesitated, glancing at his meters. "Well, your CO2 levels are a little high. How many people you got living here?" 4. "Just 4? No pets?" I shook my head. "No." He scratched his head, frowning slightly. "Weird. Might be poor ventilation. Everything else is normal, though. Radon, natural gas, VOCs, nothing dangerous." As he explained how I could buy an air quality meter on Amazon, my mind wandered again. I wasn't even listening anymore, because I felt it again, the breeze. This time, against the back of my neck, tickling the little flyaways that had escaped my ponytail. I froze. The breeze was changing direction. It fluttered against the nape of my neck, moving one way, then the other, like someone standing behind me, breathing in and out. "What the hell?" I whispered under my breath. "Did you say something?" the guy asked, glancing up from his phone. I turned to him, my mouth dry. "Do you feel it? The breeze, right now?" He paused, furrowing his brow. After a moment, he nodded. "Yeah, actually, I do." "Does it feel weird to you, like it's moving in opposite directions?" He stared at me for a second, his face going pale. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Did the real estate agent tell you what happened in this house?" My heart skipped a beat. "No," I croaked, dread pooling in my stomach. "The family that lived here before you," he said, lowering his voice, "found dead, all 4 of them, hanging from that tree out back." He nodded toward the backyard. For a moment, my world tilted. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, and my heart pounded in my chest like it was trying to escape. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. And then, out of nowhere, he burst into a wheezing laugh. "I'm just playing with you," he said, slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing in the world. I blinked, my mind still racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Heat rose to my cheeks, embarrassment mixing with the anger bubbling up inside me. How dare he joke like that? How dare he scare me like that? He must have noticed the look on my face because he quickly held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm sorry. Really, I am. I didn't mean to freak you out that much. You're not going to report me, are you?" I forced a tight smile, though I wanted nothing more than to kick him out of the house. "No, it's fine," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for coming out so late." "Yeah, no problem," he said, grabbing his toolbox and heading for the door. "Everything's good here, though. No gas leak, no carbon monoxide issues. Just, make sure to open a few windows every now and then. Keeps the air moving." I didn't even reply, I just wanted him gone. As soon as he stepped out into the darkness and I closed the door behind him, I let out a long breath. My hands were still shaking. The idea that this house had something dark in its past, even as a joke, had left me feeling unsettled. I leaned against the door for a moment, my heart still racing. But it was more than that. It wasn't just his stupid joke. It was the breeze, the way it moved, the way it felt like breathing. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me, creeping under my skin. The days passed, but the feeling never left. It wasn't constant. Some days I wouldn't feel it at all, and I'd start to convince myself that maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just my nerves after all, like Eric said. The stress of moving, of trying to adjust to this new place, this new life. But then, out of nowhere, I'd feel it again. That soft, subtle breeze, brushing against the back of my neck, or my arms, or my face. It felt intimate, like someone was standing just behind me, watching, breathing. It was driving me crazy. And it wasn't just the breeze. One afternoon, while the kids were at school and Eric was at work, I decided to tackle the pile of unpacked boxes that had been sitting in the living room for days. It was ridiculous how much stuff we had accumulated over the years, and I was starting to feel like we'd never get fully settled in. But as I was unpacking, the strangest thing happened. I was standing in front of the wall with my stud finder, trying to hang up some family photos to make the place feel more like home. The stud finder was one of those magnetic ones. You swing it back and forth, waiting for it to catch on a nail in the wall. Simple enough, right? Except nothing happened. I stood there, swinging the stud finder back and forth in front of the wall, waiting for that little tug. But no matter how many times I tried, it didn't catch on anything, not even once. Frustrated, I moved to a different part of the wall. Still nothing. I tried a different room. Nothing. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. Was I using it wrong? I had hung stuff before. This wasn't rocket science. But no matter what I did, the stud finder refused to catch on anything. After about 15 minutes of futility, I gave up. I set the photos aside, grabbed my jacket, and decided to check the mail instead. Maybe I just needed a break. As I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hit me, clearing my head. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I turned around and looked at the house, really looked at it for the first time since we'd moved in. It was an odd-looking house, I realized. Charming, but odd. A small Victorian-style house with scalloped shingles painted a soft robin's egg blue. The trim was stark white, a little too perfect, like it had been painted recently. There was a porch with engraved support columns, bare except for an old rocking chair the previous owners had left behind. But the strangest part was the turret, the little round outcropping that jutted out from the west corner of the house. From the outside, it looked like a tower, like something out of a fairy tale. But inside, it was just a small nook in the living room. Nothing special. All the extra height above the roof was just for show, part of the attic. I'd always thought turrets were supposed to have some kind of staircase winding through them, leading up to a secret room or something. But this one didn't. It was just the facade. I shook my head, chuckling to myself. I was probably overthinking it. Houses had quirks, but something about the house's design still felt off. Like it wasn't quite real, like it was hiding something beneath its charming exterior. With the mail in hand, I walked back to the front door, feeling a little more grounded. But when I reached the door, I froze. I was locked out. "What the hell?" I muttered, jiggling the handle. I could have sworn I hadn't locked it. I always made sure to leave it unlocked when I ran out for the mail. I tried again, twisting the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I let out a frustrated sigh and walked around to the back door, hoping I'd left it unlocked. It was locked too. God damn it, I groaned. Eric wasn't going to be home for hours, and I had no way of getting inside. Worse yet, I'd left my phone inside. I circled the house looking for another way in, and that's when I noticed it. One of the windows in the living room was open. I had cracked it earlier in the day to let in some fresh air, hoping it would help with the stuffy feeling in the house. It was my way in. I popped the screen out and hoisted myself up, trying to climb through. The yard sloped down a bit, so the window was higher than it looked, and it took me a couple of tries to get one leg through the window. I was halfway inside when I lost my balance. I fell hard, landing in the soft, wet dirt below the window. Pain shot through my hands and knees as I scrambled to get up. My palms stung, and when I looked down, I saw blood trickling from small cuts on my skin. Great. Just great, I muttered, brushing off the dirt. I looked up at the window, preparing to try again. But then something strange happened. As I walked back toward the front of the house, I reached for the door one last time, just out of habit. And it opened. The door, which had been locked tight just moments ago, was now wide open. My blood ran cold. I stared at the open door, my mind racing. How was this possible? Had I imagined it being locked? Had it somehow unlocked itself? I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong with this house. I could feel it. But I didn't have time to dwell on it, because the kids would be home soon, and the last thing they needed was their mum losing her mind. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I couldn't hold it in anymore. There's something wrong with this house. Eric looked up from the John Grisham book he'd been reading, his brow furrowing. What are you talking about? I could tell he was annoyed. He'd been patient with me so far, but I could sense his frustration building. He thought I was overreacting, that the stress of the move was making me paranoid. Maybe he was right, but I had to tell him. I had to say something. I explained everything, from the breeze that felt like breathing, to the locked door, to the stud finder that wouldn't work. I even told him how, when I went to clean the doorknob after cutting my hands, my blood was already gone, like it had never been there in the first place. He listened, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. So, what are you trying to say? He asked, setting his book aside. The house is haunted or something? I bit my lip. Maybe. He laughed, shaking his head. Okay. What? You don't believe me? I think the stress of the move is getting to you, he said gently, though I could hear the irritation in his voice. Look, it's a big change. We were in that old ranch for nearly 10 years. This is new, and it's going to take time to adjust. I'm not having the best time either. Really? I asked, surprised. Eric had always seemed so calm, so unflappable. Yeah, I mean, everything feels off, doesn't it? I can never find anything. I keep getting all sweaty at night and... His voice trailed off, and he glanced at something behind me. What? I asked, my pulse quickening. He hesitated for a moment, then pointed toward the closet. Look at the top of the doorframe, he said, his voice quieter than before. I turned and looked, stepping closer to the closet door. At first, nothing seemed strange, just a standard doorframe, painted white like the rest of the trim in the house. But as I squinted, Eric came up behind me and pointed. Look at the corners, he whispered. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat. There were no seams. Where the pieces of wood trim should have met, where I'd expect to see thin lines or tiny gaps, there was nothing. The entire doorframe, from top to sides, looked like it had been carved from a single piece of wood. Smooth, seamless, impossible. That's not right, I said, taking a step back, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. I checked the other windows and doors too, Eric said, his voice tight. It's the same everywhere, no seams. It's like the wood wasn't cut and fitted together. It's like it grew that way. The words made my skin prickle with unease. Houses weren't built like that. Wood didn't just grow into perfect, seamless door frames. It was as though the house had been crafted from a single living piece of something that wasn't quite right. We bought this place from a flipper, Eric continued, his voice sounding distant. They didn't do any major structural work, just cosmetic updates. So where the hell did this come from? I didn't have an answer. I'll call a contractor in the morning just to get a second opinion, Eric said after a long pause. He tried to sound reassuring, but I could tell he was unnerved. But I'm sure there's a logical explanation. He wasn't sure at all, neither was I. That night I woke up with a start. The clock read 3:43 a.m. The room was bathed in darkness, but something had yanked me from sleep. I lay still, straining to hear. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then faintly from above I heard it. A heavy thump. The sound came from the attic. Every muscle in my body tensed. I turned to Eric, who was snoring softly beside me. I shook him, my voice barely a whisper. "Eric, wake up. Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Something in the attic." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Probably just the wind, or an animal." "Please, just check. Something's up there," I whispered urgently. With a deep sigh, Eric swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. Okay, I'll check. It's probably just squirrels or something." I followed him down the hallway as he pulled down the attic hatch. The old wooden ladder creaked as he unfolded it, leading up into the dark space above. My heart raced as I watched him ascend, his form disappearing into the shadows. I stayed at the bottom of the ladder, holding my breath, listening to his footsteps thump softly across the attic floor. "Do you see anything?" I called up to him, my voice trembling. For a moment there was no answer. Then from above, Eric's voice echoed back, uncertain. "Wait, what is that?" My heart stopped. "What do you mean? What do you see?" I called again, panic rising in my chest. "I'm not sure. Hang on." I shouldn't have gone up after him. Every instinct told me to stay where I was, but curiosity and fear drove me up the ladder, one step at a time, my phone flashlight clutched in my hand. As I reached the top, I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in on me, the smell of old insulation and dust heavy in the air. When I stepped into the attic, I found Eric standing at the far corner, staring at something in the turret's nook. His body was blocking most of my view. "Eric, what is it?" I whispered, moving closer. He didn't respond right away, his eyes fixed on the corner. I quickened my pace, my phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The attic felt colder, denser, like the air itself had thickened. My footsteps creaked beneath me, the sound too loud in the heavy silence. When I finally reached him, I peered around his shoulder, and my heart nearly stopped. In the far corner of the turret, slumped against the wall, was a twisted form. At first, it looked like a person, a body, its shape humanoid, but as my flashlight swept over it, I saw that it wasn't a body at all. It was made of wood. The thing, whatever it was, looked like it had been hewn from the very beams and boards of the house itself. Twisted planks and splintered wood formed its limbs. Pink, fleshy insulation filled the gaps where muscle should have been. Drywall fragments covered parts of its head, shaped roughly like a face. A sickly glint caught my eye. One of its wooden fingers was adorned with something familiar. My heart dropped as I realized what it was. My engagement ring. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in the corner, its body, made from the house itself. And then, as we stood there, frozen, something happened that I'll never forget. The thing moved. There was a soft creaking of wood, like an old tree swaying in the wind, and the head tilted just slightly, as if it was looking at us. Eric and I bolted. We raced down the ladder, our feet barely touching the rungs as we scrambled to get away. I could hear the wood groaning above us, shifting, like the house itself was alive. My ankle twisted on the last step, and I fell hard onto the floor below, pain shooting up my leg and through my back. I gasped, struggling to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Get the kids!" Eric yelled, his voice raw with fear. We ran to their rooms, shaking them awake, our voices sharp with panic. In a daze, Ava and Hayden stumbled out of bed, barely understanding what was happening as we grabbed them and raced for the front door. We tumbled out into the driveway, breathless and terrified, the cold night air hitting our faces like a slap. I could barely stand, my ankle throbbing, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to get my family out of that house. As we piled into the car, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the keys, I glanced up at the attic window. And there, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was the shadow of something humanoid, something wrong, watching us from the turret. We never went back inside. We didn't even return for our things. The next morning we called a real estate agent and put the house on the market. No questions asked. I didn't care about the money we'd lose. I didn't care about the financial hit. I just wanted out. 27 Hillside Lane could keep its secrets. We would never be part of them again.